Okay, let's get going. So, welcome to my talk, an introduction on Livewire or Laravel Livewire, building dynamic interfaces without writing JavaScript. So we'll jump in. The obligatory who am I slide. I'm Mike. I write code. I have a company called We Are Contrast. I've been professionally unemployed for the last 2.5 years or so. I am a serial launcher of things. There's some of the things that I've launched there. And at the moment, I'm currently working on Flash Tabs and a thing called Campaign Manager. So that's stuff out of the way. What's this talk about? So this talk is about Livewire. So we're going to go through what is Livewire, how to set it up, just some of the basics there. We'll go through some of the kind of a very gentle look of how it works under the hood. We're not getting into the nitty gritty or anything. We'll have a quick overview of some of the features that it offers, and interspersed in between all of that will be lots of little demos to try and show off how these things work. So let's start with the obvious question. What is Livewire? So we'll start off by saying it was created by a guy called Caleb Porzio in January last year as a proof of concept for a Laravel version of something called Phoenix Live View. Phoenix is a framework kind of in a similar vein to Laravel, but for Elixir. And on the Livewire website, they describe it as a full stack framework for Laravel that makes building dynamic interfaces simple without leaving the comfort of Laravel. So essentially what it means is that we can make front end be dynamic, have interactions, user interactions, without actually having to write any JavaScript, which is pretty crazy. So I guess the best way to kind of understand it and get an idea of how it works is just to see it in action. So I've got a nice little demo here. Shout out if any of this is too small and if you need me to make it larger. I've tried to make everything visible. So we have a little counter here, and you can press the plus button and the number goes up, and you can press the minus button and the number goes down. And it seems pretty uninteresting. This, if for anyone who has used JavaScript, anyone who's used like Vue or React, this is pretty simple to do. The crazy bit comes in that I didn't write any JavaScript to make this happen. So we'll quickly jump back into the presentation and we'll look at how this works under the hood. So a couple of bits on how Livewire works under the hood. The initial page load, so when the counter first appears and it says 0, that loads like any other page load in Laravel, any other kind of like blade view, which means that all of the data is in the page. It's in the HTML source. That's quite nice because it means that if you've got something more complicated of a site than just a counter with 0, it means that when bots and crawlers look at your site, all of your content is there. They don't need to load any JavaScript. You don't need to worry about having special pages just for Google to be able to look at your content and to be able to crawl it, which is quite nice. So the way that this is working under the hood is that every time we click one of these buttons, Livewire is making an AJAX request behind the scenes, which is then rendering that component and sending back the HTML for that component, which has now changed. It then diffs that returned HTML with the existing DOM and only replaces the bits that it needs to replace. And this screenshot here shows one of those AJAX requests. And we're now looking at the response here, and you can see that it's got the DOM and it's got the response listed. And if I swap back to here, we can see that when I click that, we get the response. We can see that the payload is telling it that we want to run a method called increment. And the response includes, if I scroll somewhere across here, includes our result here, which is telling it to update it so that it says 1 on the screen. And if I click 2, and then we scroll across again, we'll see that it now says 2. So it's a different way of thinking about things. Oh, that didn't work. There we go. So let's look at the code behind this then. So there are 2 parts that make up a Livewire component. There is the view part to it, and then there is the component class. The view is a blade file. I guess I should have mentioned that. So this is at the moment a Laravel specific thing. So I haven't really gone into the Laravel bits on this. So if there's questions about how Laravel works at the end, feel free to ask. So we've got a blade file, and we're just using normal blade syntax here to output variables. The interesting bit here is the wire click. And this is working in a similar vein if people are familiar with Vue.js. The kind of the interface and the method names that he's chosen have been inspired by how Vue name their things as well. So wire click, this would be synonymous with like the @click in Vue.js. So we're saying when this button is clicked, we want to call the decrement method. And when this button is clicked, we want to call the increment method. So let's have a look at how those are defined. So this is our counter component. You can see that we have a public property defined. And in a similar vein to how Laravel mailables work, and also how Laravel components work, Livewire components make all public properties, they are exposed to the view as variables. So we have a count property on this class, which means we then have a count variable available to us in our view, just magically. So we can see that when this runs, it's going to call increment and it's going to add 1 to the count or remove 1 from the count. And the last part to it is the render method, which basically you tell it like a normal controller and action where you want to return a view response, you just return the view of the component code, which is the code that we showed on the previous slide. So I've just realized that I don't have my notes up anymore, so I should probably open those. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of how Livewire works. It's not a great example, but we'll get onto better examples. We'll just quickly run through how you set up Livewire. It's pretty simple to get started. We just require it from Composer. There's 2 scripts, lines of code just to add in, one before the end of the head and one before the end of the body to include the styles and the scripts for Livewire. And then Livewire exposes a number of different artisan commands to help you make your components, move them, delete them, because it's a multi-file thing. So Livewire make counter creates the 2 files that we saw previously. So the component class file and the view file. And then finally, we can use @Livewire and then the name of the component to include that component on a page. So if you want to include it into an existing blade template, then we can use that syntax. Or there is a way that if your entire page is the component only, then you can do it at a root level as well. I don't have that code on here, but you can do root Livewire and then your root and then comma and then the name of your component. Okay, let's talk about features. So one of the core features of Livewire, and in a similar vein is also Vue.js does this as well, is data binding. So we want to bind a property in our component class to the value of a text field, for example, on a form. So here, very similar to what we saw before. So we've got a public property called name. We've got our render telling it which view to use to output. And then in our view, we've got an input field and we're using wire : model, which again is very similar, if you're familiar with how Vue.js works, to the v model attribute. And we're just saying we want to link this input field to the name property. And then all we're doing underneath is just outputting the name using normal blade syntax. So let's have a look at an example of this. So again, so we can put our name in, and you see the updates. Now, this isn't very impressive when we first look at it, because anyone who's familiar with Vue, again, this is a very simple thing to do in Vue. But the fact that we haven't written any JavaScript at all is the thing that makes this impressive. And again, that every time we make a change here, it's firing an AJAX request behind the scenes in order to keep this synced. That's a good question. How do I go back? There. That's data binding. So our next section is actions. So we saw this in the counter that I had in the first example of the buttons. So I've just got another example here where we can reset the name that we're looking at. So we've got our text field with our model hooked up to name, and then we've got a wire click. If I move that out of the way, we've got a wire click with a reset name. It calls the reset name method. So if we have a quick look at that. So again, we've got a similar form, so we can type our name in, and as we saw, when we click reset, it's going to reset the name to the text reset. And you can see that it's updated both. And again, if we have a look in here, so if we type in, oh, not there, type in, we can see that it's firing off an AJAX request in order to make this update. And when we click reset, it's firing off an AJAX request again. If we look at the payload for the request, we can see that it's saying that we want to call a method, and the method name is reset name, which is what we've set up. And the response that's coming back is setting the name to reset. And it's also resetting the value of this as well to the text reset. So let's try and go back. That's the basics of actions. The next thing we have is events. So events work in a similar way to actions, but they can be called and cause different components to react to them, like events in anything, really. I struggled coming up with a simple example for this. So this isn't a great example of it, but essentially we have our public property again. And this is showing how we define event listeners in the component class. So there's a couple of different ways that we can do this. If our event name is the same name as the function that we're going to call, then we just define the event name. If the event name is different to the function that we wanted to call, so for example, if our event name was update time, but our function was called do update time, for example, then we would say update time as the key, and the value of that array element would be do update time. So we can have them different if we want them to. And we'll get on to what mount is on the next slide. So let's have a quick look at, so I think we've got the blade view for this, which again is just using typical blade syntax to output. And we've got our button, and you can see here, I'm just showing an example that we can add in Vue-like syntax to prevent things. So for example, if this was a submit button on a form, we wouldn't want it to actually submit the page. So you can do things like click.prevent. And in a similar vein to Vue.js, Livewire also exposes a kind of magic property called $emit, which allows us to emit these events. So we can see here that we're emitting the event update time. So if we jump into the demo, we can see that we've got the time. It's an hour behind, but who cares? And we can click update time, and it's causing it to update. Again, all these things don't seem that impressive on the face of it. But when you think that we haven't written any JavaScript and we're getting these, and it's not reloading the page, it becomes very much more impressive. And you can see the same things are happening here. It's just now we're seeing events being fired, and the DOM is being updated in the same way as before. Let's see if I can. So, I mentioned, so the previous one used a mount, which is part of the life cycle. So there's a couple of parts of the life cycle of a Livewire component. So one of them is mount. Mount is it runs immediately after the component is instantiated, but before render is called, which is omitted from this just to save on space. Mount is important because you shouldn't be using the double underscore construct. You shouldn't be using a constructor, the typical PHP constructor, when it comes to Livewire component classes, because that is Livewire uses that, so it exposes the mount method instead, which again should feel somewhat familiar to you if you've used something like Vue.js before. So here we're setting a public property that will be exposed on the sorry, my mind went blank there. It'll be exposed in the Blade template, which again we can just use in Blade template, normal Blade template syntax. So Livewire doesn't include anything for doing loops. So in the same way that Vue offers v-for or v-if, we don't need that in Livewire because we can just use @for-each or @if. We can use anything that we would normally use in Blade. We can use in the Livewire component views. So we can take a quick look at this. So again, doesn't look very impressive. This one's not very interactive either. But essentially what's happened here is we've got no AJAX requests this time because all the data is being loaded. But if we had, for example, a refresh button, we could have a refresh button that calls that method again and would cause this data to come back in without having to write any more JavaScript or any JavaScript, and without having to do a page reload either. It would only pull in the component HTML. So quickly go through the other parts of the life cycle. So we have hydrate, which is I'm just going to do now quickly and have a drink of water. Hydrate runs on every request after the component is hydrated. So after the data has been filled back into the component class, but before any action is performed or before render is called, if there is no action. You've then got updating and updating foo, which are ways, so they're run before Livewire updates any component data. So if it's trying to keep it in sync, so you can make any changes that you want to. So for example, you can use Laravel's string helpers or string methods to manipulate any data that's coming in. So they could be run before, and then we've got updated and updated foo, which are run afterwards. So they're basically the same as updating, but they're run after the data has been updated. Okay. So we've gone over some use cases there. Maybe they don't seem that useful. So when should we use Livewire? Well, Livewire is great for displaying dynamic data from the backend. So for example, if you're searching a paginated list of models from your database, that's a great example. We can do that in something like Vue.js, and it's not difficult, but it requires a lot of boilerplate in order to make it work. You need to have your method that's going to make your AJAX request. Then you need to make sure you've got your API set up for it that's going to return back a JSON format version of your code, of your data, which then your Vue code is going to have to interpret and then display out and template basically. So there's a lot of boilerplate that needs to be done in order to facilitate that. And Livewire basically makes that interaction much more simple. For pure front-end interactions, you're probably best sticking with JavaScript. So for example, the counter that I showed is probably best to stick with pure JavaScript or something like Vue or React. I have a demo button there. Is that meant to be for that? Don't think that demo button's meant to be there. That's meant to be for this. So let's look at a much better use case for it, which is doing a user search. So we can see here, I tell you what, let's just jump into, well, that didn't work. Good. It's got the wrong link. Okay, so here we can see this is our example of a much better use case. So we've got all of the users being listed in a paginated list here, and we can swap through the list. You can see that it's nice and quick going through, and each time that we're doing something here, this is causing an AJAX request to happen. If I refresh the page, if I go back to page 1 and I refresh the page, we can see that in the source, all of this is actually in the source. So this is what I was speaking about before, where we get the SEO benefits here because we're not having to wait. Googlebot's not having to wait for that code, for that data to be added into the source. And we can also do a search. And we can see that we get a nice, fast, responsive, interactive user experience without having to write any JavaScript, which is, to me, the really impressive part. Let's look at how that's working. So Livewire includes a trait with it, where if you're going to use pagination, then you just include the with pagination trait and it just magically works for you. Again, we've got a public property called search, and our render function is passing through some data to our blade file. So we're passing through our paginated list of database models. If we look at the view that goes with this, we've got our search box at the top, which again is using wire model to data bind it to the search property on the component class. And we've got our table that is outputting, and again, it's just using standard blade syntax to loop through each of those models and to output each of them. And at the very bottom there, it's using Laravel's built-in pagination to output the links as well for the pagination. So this is a much better use of, or a much better use case for something like Livewire. It makes a lot more sense because we haven't had to write really any code. There's a very small amount of code to get something as nice to use and as interactive to use and as quick as what we've seen there. But there's more. There's more. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. The idea of this talk is to kind of give you a very rough overview there of where Livewire is useful. But there's a lot more things here. So we've got validation. So it supports Laravel style request validations with displaying errors and halting out of a request, aborting a request if it fails validation. It can handle file uploads easily as well, all through traits. Authorization, so similar to how Laravel controllers can do authorization through policies, Livewire supports that as well, as we've seen before. Pagination as well makes it really simple to do pagination. You can also redirect. So, for example, if we have an action, can just return a standard return redirect method, and Livewire will handle facilitating that redirect. It supports Laravel's session-based Flash messages as well. We can nest components, but there are a couple of gotchas when it comes to nesting components. So nested components can accept data from their parents. However, they're not reactive like properties are in view components. So that's something to just be aware of. And Livewire components should not be used for extracting blade snippets into separate files. If you want to clean up your blade files, just move them into separate blade files and include them in the normal way you would include them in, using @includes rather than a Livewire component. The other thing to mention here is if you are looking to do nested components, then I would heavily recommend watching the screencast that is on the Livewire docs, because it talks about the parent-child kind of like updating, which doesn't work the same as Vue. So if you come from Vue, like I do, it works a little bit oddly to how you might expect from how Vue works. So I would highly recommend watching that if you're going to be looking to use nested components. Even more features. This is why I didn't go too heavily into this. Otherwise, this talk would be several hours long. We've got things like loading states. So obviously there is a delay between when a user interacts with your page. So for example, clicking a button or typing into a field, and the round trip it takes to get to the request to the server and back again. So it has directives built in to handle those states, so that when a request is happening, you can say stop a button from being clicked again because it's already been clicked. So it's got ways of nicely handling that. Polling. So this is a lightweight alternative to WebSockets. So if you want to keep a component up to date in the background, you can tell it to poll every 2 seconds, and it will run a certain method every 2 seconds to keep that data updated. And it's got a nice thing in there that it will automatically reduce the frequency of polling when the tab is in the background as well. So all these things where we can do them in JavaScript, and we can do these things in like Vue.js and React, but we're not having to write any JavaScript to actually do any of this. It's got prefetching. So we can prefetch the results of an action when the mouse rolls over a certain element. However, this shouldn't be used when the action that's run has side effects. So for example, writing things to a database, or, you wouldn't want to have it that when the user hovers over the transfer money button in your banking app, that it transfers the money. It has a side effect. We wouldn't want that to happen using prefetching. But that's quite a nice feature. And again, we don't have to write any JavaScript to make that happen. We've got offline states. So obviously, Livewire heavily relies on you having a connection to the server for it to work. So it has built-in directives so that you can tell when a user has lost their internet connection, and to display and change the state of the UI. For example, to disable submit buttons when they're in an offline state. We also have dirty states, which is a term used to describe models when they have changed but not been synced properly, or not been synced fully with the backend. So again, you might want to show that they're awaiting syncing of that data, and it's got built-in directives in order to be able to handle that as well. We've got defer loading. So if, for example, if you have an expensive request or an expensive action that needs to be performed, and you don't want it to be performed on your initial page load, you could make it work a little bit more how something like Vue or React would work without server-side rendering, by having that call happen after the initial page load. And then finally, we've got Alpine.js, which I've just realized I haven't written any notes for, which is helpful. But Alpine.js is basically also written by Caleb Porzio, and is kind of a supplementary JavaScript framework for using with Livewire. So, in summary, Livewire allows you to build dynamic and interactive web applications without having to touch JavaScript, unless, of course, you want to, and in which case Alpine.js is there for you. Or you can still obviously use things like Vue and React. It's best used in situations where you're retrieving data from the back end and then displaying it on the front end. So dynamic data. So things like search lists, like an autocomplete would be useful for something like this as well. Because the initial page load is just a normal blade view, everything is included in the HTML. Googlebot doesn't need to wait. That says does need to wait. Good. Does not need to wait for your content to load.